Hey there, Saints fans. I'm Micahel Hecht, President and CEO of Greater New Orleans Inc., GNO Inc. And I'm here with my good old friend, old meaning for many years, Andy Kopplin, who's the President and CEO of the Greater New Orleans Foundation. And we're really glad to be joining you today to talk about, from our perspective and our organizations, how we're working with other great organizations like the Saints and so many others in the community to not only make it through the coronavirus crisis, but come out the other side ready for the future, and in some ways stronger than before. For me, I should say that this is not my first disaster. I say it's not my first rodeo, just a different bull. My experience with these events probably goes back all the way to owning a restaurant and living through the dot-com crash in San Francisco back in 2001, now many years ago. And then I was working for the Bloomberg administration in New York City and led the small business response for 9/11, then came down to my ancestral homeland of New Orleans and Louisiana, and was involved actually working for Andy at the state level, running the state level response. And so there's a lot of experience that comes up to this. And I think that when you are sitting here, of course, this is an unprecedented event for the entire world, but elements of it feel familiar. There's a certain kind of physical memory to what we need to do, and a certain kind of empirical understanding that we're going to make it through, and there's going to be a lot of opportunity that comes through, and that we can honor those who have suffered by building something better on the other side, like Andy and I and so many others tried to do post Katrina. So I think the framing that we're using at GNO Inc. to try to think about this is that there's three phases. The first phase of this event was the medical crisis, and that was all about flattening the curve. Something which actually I think Louisiana is doing a very good job of now, and in some ways was forced to be a leader for the country. And that's all about the health response. The next phase that we want to get to is getting back to work in the new normal. But before we get to that, businesses, whether it's small shops or large companies or even sports teams, have to make it there. And that's about liquidity, because the necessary response, the necessary cure for coronavirus has been really a shutdown of the economy by fiat. We had no choice, but it's caused a liquidity crisis because nobody's spending any money. People can't go out and spend. And so demand has been depressed. And so this liquidity crisis is being addressed by the federal government by literally trillions of dollars coming down to give to companies, to give to individuals, to give to the unemployed as a way of helping them to make it through. You could think about it like a heart that has had a shock and has stopped beating, and now we're giving it artificial CPR until it can start beating on its own again. That beating on its own again is getting back to work in the new normal. And that's the phase that we're trying to grapple with right now at every level. And that's going to be about what are the conditions that we need to have in order to start getting back to work. We have to make sure the curve is flat. We have to make sure we have tests so we can understand who might be immune. We have to make sure our hospitals have the capacity to not only handle what's happening today, but a potential future surge if there is a second wave, as we're seeing in other places around the world. And then we know that there are going to be some cross-cutting elements that every business is going to have to put in place. Social distancing, good hygiene, testing of individuals. There's even an app that's coming out right now that I'm told where your phone, it's like Shazam, but you're going to be able to cough into it, and it's going to be able to tell you whether it's a good cough or a bad cough. All of these things are going to become standard as a way of getting back to work. But as we get back online, I think what we're going to see is the slow recovery. It's not going to be a V. It might be a U. Hopefully it won't be a W, but it could possibly be. But there's also going to be opportunity there. We're going to see manufacturing coming back from China. And frankly, I think we're going to see that second cities and lower cost markets like Greater New Orleans are going to attract people from other markets like New York at even a faster rate than we were before. So I think that for all of us now, we're trying to do two things. We're trying to look at the ground to make sure we don't trip, but at the same time, look at the horizon and see what opportunities are out there in the future and make sure we're pointing in the same direction. So that's kind of my 38,000 foot framing. Andy, I'd love to turn it over to you, get your experience from the nonprofit and GNOF standpoint. And also, I think your experience is so relevant and important here.
Thank you, Michael. And it's great to be on Saints TV. I think the best way to think about this is actually using the three phases that you described, and they are equally relevant to the nonprofit and social sector. So when the pandemic hit, we immediately activated our disaster fund. We do this after every disaster because the folks in the greater New Orleans region are among the most generous in the world. And we know what it's like to be laid flat on your back, 10 feet underwater, and left for dead. And it was the wonderful philanthropy and love shown to us by people around the world after Katrina that helped us get back on our feet. And our folks remember that. So every time there's a disaster, we come in, whether it was Hurricane Harvey, whether it was Hurricane Irma or Maria, the Baton Rouge floods, the BP oil spill, the tornadoes in New Orleans East, we raise a disaster fund because people want to help. And so in this case, we opened the disaster fund because we knew it was going to be important in New Orleans. We were, unfortunately, the tip of the spear among many cities in the United States where the pandemic hit first. And as Michael said, I think we had to take some of the most proactive measures quickest. So on the nonprofit side, we started raising money, and we knew a few things from the outset that there were going to be vulnerable populations like the elderly who were more vulnerable to the disease, the homeless who lacked the hygiene facilities that are needed to keep themselves safe, that there were going to be low-wage workers and small businesses that were going to be adversely affected. So we opened up our disaster fund and started raising money to get immediate grants to food banks and food pantries, to the folks and councils on aging who provide Meals on Wheels, and to make sure that low-wage workers could get the support they needed. As we were launching that, we were just had the great fortune to develop a relationship with Mrs. Benson, who is a trustee of the Greater New Orleans Foundation. And she said, I've got to do something for the hospitality and service industry workers who are the front lines, who are really the backbone of so much of our New Orleans economy, whether it's at Saints and Pelicans games, whether they're ticket takers or food service workers, or whether it's at our restaurants, our hotels, our bars. We are a hospitality economy. It's time for us to really have the backs of the folks who have our backs all year long and every day. And so she gave a big donation to set up the Gail Benson Community Assistance Fund at the Greater New Orleans Foundation, and asked us first to take the lead on running what we call the Family Assistance Program, which provides $1,000 grants to laid off hotel, restaurant, and bar workers who have families that they're trying to support in this difficult period. We've taken Mrs. Benson's money, more than doubled it, and we're in the process of giving out over 1,000 grants of $1,000 to the most vulnerable families in our region, again, because this is their moment of need. There are tens of thousands of workers in our region who need help, and we believe that the most important help that we can provide is to those low-wage workers who are raising kids, who are taking care of elderly parents. And so we're really fortunate to have that program launched in partnership with the Restaurant Association, Mrs. Benson, and the Micahel Company. In addition, as we look further out, we're raising money to try to help make sure that our food security system, the Second Harvesters Food Bank and all the food pantries, are positioned to be able to do the work that they do every day, but at much smaller scale than we're going to have to do right now when we've got this extremely high levels of unemployment and food insecurity in our community. So we're working to make sure that they are stood up, that they are resourced appropriately, and then we're looking at how we can expand that partnership to one with private sector restaurateurs. Because again, the food bank shouldn't be stood up for the size and scale of this kind of problem. There's a level of support that the food bank needs year round, and they do it in partnership with restaurants. But at the massive scale that we're experiencing right now, standing up the food bank at double its size is not the right way to go. It's to make sure that we engage the private sector restaurateurs in that effort. And so we're working on expanding those programs because, as Michael said, this recovery, especially in New Orleans, might take longer than it takes in other communities because of the concentration of hospitality and service industry jobs in our region. Those jobs may be slower to come back, and therefore our families are more vulnerable, and food insecurity is going to be a bigger challenge here in our community. So we're trying to prepare for that. The other thing, of course, that we've seen recently is nothing new, but every time it strikes us, the starkness by which the racial disparities in health outcomes appear is a critical issue. And so what we've seen in Louisiana in the New Orleans region is that African Americans are taking the brunt of the coronavirus more significantly than other populations. And there's lots of reasons that go back hundreds of years in terms of racial inequity, also poverty, that lead that to be the case. And so the coronavirus did not create inequity in health outcomes in America, but again, it has exposed it. And so we're going to be doing some grant making to help our federally qualified health clinics and other organizations on the front line make sure that we reach into the neighborhoods, that we help folks access the care that they need to be safe and healthy, and that when they get that care, they're able to get the first-class care that they need to make sure that they and their families stay safe. And this leads us to, I think, the third point, which is how do we take what we learn from this pandemic and the extreme devastation? We've lost some of our most wonderful citizens of New Orleans and across the country, and we'll lose more before this thing is over. So Ellis Marcellus was a fund holder here at the Greater New Orleans Foundation, and he was obviously a revered patriarch of the Marcellus family. And that loss is not something that we're going to be able to overcome. We're not even able to mourn him properly because of the public health restrictions on funerals and second lines. I mean, can you imagine the second line that we ought to be having in this community for Ellis Marcellus? And that's something that we're not going to be able to do. And so the question is, how do you honor that legacy? How do you honor that loss? And how do we come back in a way that continues to put New Orleans in the lead on doing smart things to build our community in a smart way for the 21st century? What can we do to expand high quality healthcare access and health equity in communities? What can we do to further strengthen small businesses? What can we do to further diversify our economy? How do we make sure the social sector stays strong, just like the small business sector? Because again, these nonprofits are the backbone of social services in our community. We need them to get through this pandemic, just as we need the restaurateurs to be able to come out on the other side strong and able to take care of their missions. And so as we think about the future, I think it's really important that we also do our best to try to get the federal funds. And this is the legacy of my work after Katrina. If not for the generosity of philanthropy and faith-based organizations, and also taxpayers who supported our recovery, we would not have been able to have the renaissance that we've been able to have in New Orleans. And so when you look at the legislation that recently passed, where 500,000 population cities got written into the congressional bill, but those like New Orleans that are smaller than that were excluded, that's something that we've got to change. And if we look at the level of impact of the coronavirus that we've had, the number of cases, the number of deaths, the health disparities that we have, and then we look at the economy and where communities are most vulnerable to the public health measures that we were forced to impose to get ourselves back healthy and fight the pandemic, we're vulnerable both in terms of lives and livelihoods. And when you measure both those things together, New Orleans stands alone as one of the most vulnerable communities in America. And therefore, the resources that we need to fight the pandemic here to bring our community back are disproportionately larger. And I think when folks look at the facts and they are rational in thinking about it, they can look at this and say, yes, New Orleans and communities like it need to get the additional resources from the federal government, because we got to have that liquidity to be able to pull through. And then we ourselves, leaders in this community, citizens in this community, need to prove again our resilience to show how we can lead and win the recovery as well as we possibly can, so we can honor those lives that have been lost in this pandemic. And so that's kind of the way I look at it from the Greater New Orleans Foundation. We're just privileged to be in a position to be able to help at a time like this. So for us, the relationships that we've built with philanthropists who've been generously helping us meet this moment, that's what we were as an organization created to do. And so my team, they're all working from home. but they're working as hard as they possibly can to make sure that they can make the difference at this time when we're most needed. Just, I know, Michael, as your team is, going from, sunrise to sunset and then beyond, trying to make sure that you are there to be the advocate for public policy changes and the information source to businesses in our community, and the thought leader for how to think about how to come through this recovery in a smart way. And so that's, time when we can, I guess, move into some Q&A. And so, Michael, why don't you talk a little bit more about that information and advocacy role that you guys are playing at GNO Inc.?
Well, I think that a couple of the lessons that we've learned from our past experience working together is that information and advocacy are two of the key things that you have to do. In the fog of war, people want concise, actionable, credible information that makes it a little bit less foggy. And so we're doing some very basic things. We are putting out daily updates that have just the news you can use. We take all of the loan programs and various funding opportunities, and we do webinars, we do one-pagers, we put them on a single sheet. We do anything to kind of help distill down issues and opportunities to the point at which people can look on it and make a decision. People find that very assuring. And then in terms of advocacy, we came out very early advocating for a program that would get funds to businesses, but using local banks instead of using the SBA. This program actually became the Paycheck Protection Program that now is going to be re-upped, I hope this afternoon, for another $300 billion. And again, that goes back to our past experience where we knew that speed was the issue when liquidity was the crisis. We've also done advocacy around issues like banks giving forbearance for people that hold debt, giving more assistance to those that hold commercial real estate so that they can give a break to their tenants. And actually this week, we're going to be meeting with all of our congressional delegation again, just to check in and talk about what we can do, not just today, but in a future infrastructure bill, which we think is going to come down. Just like with Katrina, we have an opportunity here to access funds that would not be available otherwise, and not just rebuild from the economic and physical damage, but build something better going forward. So Andy, looking back on your experience from Katrina and applying it to today, what's the one thing that we definitely should be doing, and what was the one mistake that you made that we're not going to make again?
So I think the thing that we can't miss is the fight to make sure that we get a fair share of resources. And again, when you think about liquidity, I mean, there's nobody else other than the federal government who can pass a $2.2 trillion bailout bill for our country. And we need to make sure that that bill is written with the needs that American cities have in mind, in American regions like ours. And just as you represent, the Southeast Louisiana region, so do we. So when I say New Orleans, I mean the entire region. And the other thing they need to do is make sure that we know about, disproportionate impact. The fact that we've got health disparities in this region should count for something, because it certainly counts in terms of the impact that our citizens face, our hospitals and healthcare workers face. The fact that we had endemic poverty should count. The fact that our economy, which is a wonderful economy pre-pandemic, but it's not built for physical distancing requirements, shelter-in-place requirements, and the kind of public health measures. And congressional action should recognize that as well, because the Brookings Institution first noted that Orlando, Las Vegas, and New Orleans were uniquely vulnerable to the kind of public health measures that we've got. Well, we're uniquely vulnerable on that measure, but we're also vulnerable in terms of poverty, health disparities, and those things that make it more acute in our region. So those things, besides population, should also influence this legislation. I think we can't miss that. I think the other thing that is really important that you want to make sure is that bureaucracy doesn't get in the way. And I think that you identified this one. If money's going to hit the table, let's worry about getting it into the hands of people who need it more than we worry about dotting every I and crossing every T. Right. And that's a lesson, whether it's the federal government, the state government, local government, is remember the mission. The mission is to get the money to the ground to the people who need it so that they can rebuild the economy and rebuild their lives and take care of their loved ones. And that's what we're trying to do. And that's, again, why it's fun for me to be in the private sector running this grants program for families. We're able to get money in, family supply, money out the door, in a matter of days and weeks rather than months and years. And it's quite a difference. And it's nice to see an organization move to immediate remote operations. Everything is online. We have folks uploading on their phones the documentation required, and then we're sending them a link to an account with our bank that they can access and get money direct deposited to their account. And so we've been getting out grants within 14 days of the application because people need the money now.
Right.
So Michael, let's go back to you a little bit. In terms of the Paycheck Protection Program and the small business loans, tell me how those are working for businesses in our region and whether there are additional tweaks that you think there's going to be in this next round of legislation that really might expand the pool and availability of those loans.
Thanks. And just first to your point before, what we're advocating for in terms of how funds are allocated is upon three criteria. One is simple population. The second is number of COVID cases. And the third is economic damage. And we hope that that more dynamic and rich set will capture and will actually get what we should receive here in Louisiana. The PPP, I think people need to understand for all of the challenges with it up front, and there have been some challenges. I think that the interest rate might have been set a little too low for the banks to really act like we wanted them to, and other issues. It's been the biggest, fastest, most directly impactful business assistance program in American history. Billions have already gone out the door, 350 billion. And so it is impressive really at that level. Now, there are some things that we have to change going forward. First of all, we just need more money. Today, I'm hopeful another 300 billion or so will be approved. I think by the time we're done, we'll get close to $1 trillion that's going to get allocated. Then there's some other challenges that need to get tweaked. Currently, 501c6s are not eligible. There are many 501c6 organizations in the country, including economic development organizations, that are deserving of the support and are going to be on the front line. There's some tweaks that have to be made to allow companies that have venture capital support. So some of our startups are currently having challenges applying because of something called the affiliation rule. And then there's some other things I think that could be done to make it more attractive and to bring more banks in so that it actually gets out even faster. And that involves everything from the interest rate to just clarifying the rules coming down from the Fed and the SBA to our local banks. Those tweaks will continue to be made, but I do think it's important to recognize that overall, I mean, frankly, Andy, this is far bigger than anything that we saw during our days of Katrina, where tens of billions were huge numbers. And we weren't talking about trillions, and now it's like, what's another trillion?
I know you guys have been working with local firms as well on G&O Pivot. Why don't you tell us a little bit more about how you're helping firms retool themselves to meet this moment?
Thanks for that. You have to kind of go step back a little bit. There's a history in New Orleans. And actually, if you look at where Dixie Beer is now in New Orleans East, it goes out towards Dixie Beer, where Andrew Higgins took an operation making pirogues to go into the swamp, and he pivoted it to make landing crafts for the Army, for the Navy, for the U.S. that allowed us to basically win World War II at Normandy on D-Day and essentially save the free world. In that pivot, he not only saved the free world, but Higgins Industries went from 75 people to 20,000 and actually became the first truly integrated workshop in all of New Orleans. So a real success story for the company as well. What we're seeing now, maybe at a somewhat smaller scale in the coronavirus fight, is local companies doing the same. We see distillers and brewers making hand sanitizers and pepper companies bottling it. We see clothing companies making gowns and masks. We even see companies in our new workspaces like Scale that are using 3D manufacturing to make PPE like masks that are going to our hospitals and our other medical professionals. So we set up a site called G&O Pivot where companies can sign up, talk about what their product is, and then we'll connect them to hospitals or municipalities or other organizations that need them. We've had well over 50 companies sign up for their pivots. And I think what's so exciting about this is that we're not only stepping up to serve urgent needs in our community, but it's also about companies finding incremental or new cash flow opportunities to keep their employees hired and keep their doors open. And so it's an important win-win. And G&O Pivot has worked, I think, in a way that would make Andrew Higgins proud.
One of the biggest food distributors right now in our region is an organization called the NOLA Tree Project. So what does trees have to do with food distribution? And it's an organization that was in the business of trying to regreen New Orleans, bring us back a tree canopy. But in a moment of crisis like the pandemic, what they had was an organization and they had volunteers. And then, nobody's out tree planting these days, but there's a lot of folks who are shut in who need food distributed. So they pivoted their organizational structure in the nonprofit sector, turned their volunteers into meal delivery services, and have successfully found a role and a mission that is incredibly valuable at this time, in the same way that some of our small businesses have done.
So in a moment like this, what you find is that everybody is asking, what can I do? What can I do as an individual? What can I do as a company? Not everybody has the resources to do something on the scale of a Gail Benson Community Assistance Fund or what the Saints of the Pelicans are doing. And what I tell them is that everybody can be incredibly important. You just have to pick one issue, one project, and apply yourself to it with vigor and passion, and you're going to be making a difference. And so that could be volunteering at the food bank. That could be buying a gift card from your favorite restaurant or shop. That could be mentoring somebody that's having a challenge going through this moment. Whatever it is, I guess to quote the state, you got to pick your passion. And nobody is better at that than here in Southeast Louisiana, whether it's the Cajun Navy or it's the Saints or it's Greater New Orleans Foundation. People are very good at leaning forward, finding their one thing, and then making it part of the solution. So that's my general advice: is pick that one thing that's your passion, that you have expertise in, and make a difference in that way. Andy, what do you think?
Yeah, I think that's great. We have a philosophy at the foundation. We say everybody can be a philanthropist. And so whether you've got millions of dollars to give away or hundreds of dollars to give away or your time to give away, we ask everybody to do what they can. Leah Chase gave us a lesson in that. She said, I didn't know what a philanthropist was. And all these philanthropists were coming in. And I finally said to myself, it's really just about looking inside and seeing what you can do to make a difference. And I think that's what we have that no other community in America has, is that experience. It goes way back, but we know how to come together. We know how to roll up our sleeves, dive in, and we know how to do it together. And so when we do that together, when we take care of each other together, when we come back together, we have the ability, I think, to win the recovery. And what's really, really important is for us to stay together, take care of one another, be thoughtful about how we come back, and then do it right, do it better than anybody else, and put New Orleans back on the map as the people who figured out how to fight COVID, figure out how to get control of their community, make it safe, and then come back stronger and more resilient and better. And we can do that because our folks are ready to do it. We've done it before. We can do it again. It's different, but we've got the same DNA that allowed us to do that last time. And let's do it this time again in New Orleans.
Andy, couldn't agree more than that. And all I can say is that we're very fortunate at a time like this to have leaders like you with your experience and your attitude. So thanks for everything that you do. Thanks to the Saints organization, all of their leadership, to Gail Benson, to everybody for being such an extraordinary partner to the community in so many ways. And to all those Saints fans that are watching out there, thank you for making this place so special. We do it for you, and we look forward to seeing you back out on the field. Who dat?
Who dat? Thank you, Michael. Thank you for your leadership. Enjoyed the podcast with you.